Take away.
Right, thank you very much everyone, and of course a big thank you for actually coming at 10 o'clock on the Sunday morning. If you're anything like me, you were out and you had a couple of glasses last night. Fortunately only a couple of glasses, although they may be the only spirits I'm going to see this weekend. However, we'll have a look and we'll see. What I'm going to do today, just this morning, just for a tiny part, not for the whole day, what I'm going to do is talk to you about just a brief look at the history of talking to the dead. I'm not going to talk about everything. I'm going to pick out a few highlights, a few sort of milestones as we go along, and talk a little bit more about those than about some things. That's basically just a cop-out, so that when somebody thinks, hang on, he didn't talk about, I say, oh yeah, that was one of the ones I decided to miss out, so covering myself there. The history of talking to the dead goes back far beyond recorded history, which kind of gives us a little bit of a problem, because if there are no records, we don't know exactly what happened. But from looking at cave paintings, etc., various peoples have made suppositions that the Stone Age peoples did indeed attempt to talk to the dead. The sort of things they're talking about are the shaman of the tribes actually partaking hallucinogenic substances to put them in heightened and altered states so that they can communicate with the spirit world. But also another thing, in cave paintings, I'm sure a lot of you are aware of the fact that one motif that's very, very common is a hand pressed against the wall, red ochre sprayed against it, so you've got the imprint of the hand there. And one theory about that is they were done largely in inaccessible areas of the caves, and those areas were regarded as the sort of boundary between this world and the next world. So people were going there and almost essentially pushing through, if you like, to the other world as much as they could, just trying to communicate with their ancestors. But as I say, these are just theories. We've got no hard and solid facts about them. It's just supposition based on the evidence that we're given. We have to really move on to the time when writing began as to when we start to have written records. And one of the first written records that we have of talking to the dead is this. Ow. Static. I hope that was just static. I'm going to get that every time I speak. The Epic of Gilgamesh, ladies and gentlemen. I put the title up, but I'm sure you all recognised it from the text there we've got in front of you. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest written version we've got, the oldest extant version we've got, is from the 7th century BC. And the most complete version we've got is recorded on a set of 12 clay tablets, just like these ones. And on tablet number 7, it records the fact that Gilgamesh's great friend, who he's gone on a lot of journeys, a lot of adventures with, Enkidu, dies. Oh, no static electric shock that time. So this is Enkidu here. Now, there's been a lot of stuff written in fortune tomes about Enkidu. You know, if you look at him there, he's kind of quite monkey-like. So there are a lot of people who suggest that Enkidu is actually a Neanderthal, because some of the descriptions of him describe him as short, stocky, and covered in a lot of hair. However, this is not what I'm interested in at the moment. What happens is Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is totally beside himself about this, and he wants to continue communicating with his friends. So he goes on a series of adventures and eventually ends up in the realm of the dead, actually face to face with Enkidu, talking to him, just for one brief moment, for one section in the whole works. So that's the earliest version of talking to the dead we've got in writing. I've said that's from the 7th century BC. In fact, it's believed that the story of Gilgamesh dates to the 27th century BC, so 2,700 years BC, so near as damn it 6,000 years ago. So that's one of the earliest records that we've got. I'm excluding talking to gods and things like that, okay? It's specifically people who have passed over. So I'm not talking about Egyptians talking to their gods, etc., etc. So 2700 BC is the first record. We've then got quite a few spread throughout the Old Testament of the Bible. Exactly when that's written is obviously one of these things that's majorly up for date, but you know, somewhere around 1000 BC, 600 BC, somewhere within that time period is a reasonable guess. And there are a number of pronouncements, there are a number of statements in the Bible, in the Old Testament, about talking to the dead. Most of them are things saying, don't do it. If you do it, if you talk to the dead, dire things will happen to you. For example, I've got 50 more pictures to
Take off the shoes.
Oh, and well, that gets to by the end of the talk. So, Leviticus, and I'm sure Leviticus is familiar to many of us from time spent at school when we had to study the Bible and we turned to the dirty bits. This is not one of the dirty bits of the Bible. If you don't know the dirty bits of Leviticus, go back to your hotel, check out your Gideon Bible. Do not turn to mediums or seek out spirits, for you will be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God. So there you are. If you talk to spirits, if you talk to the dead, you're going to be defiled by them. That's pretty bad, okay? So, there are more things. Yay! Isaiah 8:19. When men tell you to consult mediums and spiritists who whisper and mutter, why consult the dead on behalf of the living? Yeah, because if these things are dead people, they're just the same as us, except they're dead. So why should they know the future necessarily? Because that's what a lot of people talk about, the spirits, and yeah. So why should they know that? Why should they have more wisdom than we do? They might know where they buried the treasure that they always promised you as the family heirloom or whatever. That's fair enough. Yeah. Not just spirits defiling you though. If you actually continue to do this and talk to the dead, it can get a bit nastier for you. Saul died because he was unfaithful to the Lord. He did not keep the word of the Lord and even consulted a medium for guidance, and he did not inquire of the Lord, so the Lord put him to death in his magnificence. Yeah. So there we have an example of the well, yeah. Yeah, putting to death for talking to the dead. This is the Witch of Endor story for those of you who are keeping notes. One more. Leviticus, again. Men and women among you who act as mediums or psychics must be put to death by stoning. Okay. Now, Leviticus. A lot of people still live by the rules of Leviticus. Okay. So, mediums should be put to death by stoning. I saw Joe Power earlier on this year at the Edinburgh Fringe. The venue sat a lot more people than we have here today, a lot more space than we have here today. The number of people who were in the venue was probably equivalent to the front row here. He was not the most popular person. I think he'd booked the Fringe venue on the power of his Darren Brown show. But unfortunately, because of the timing of it all, he had to book it before the show was broadcast. So he booked it, invested all the money and everything, thinking, I'm going to be on Darren Brown, people are going to love me, they're going to want to come and see my show. Then he was in Darren Brown, and it's probably unfit to print what he thought after seeing him. If you've never seen the show, I suggest you look it up. It's on YouTube, and it is well worth watching, and there are various sort of arguments going on about it, including postings of anonymous footage that was shot at the time by somebody who just happened to be there and is not Joe Powers' wife at all. No, not her. So, this is the Old Testament, and largely speaking, for the next few hundred years, in the Western world at least, you know, this sort of thing was not strictly obeyed. No mediums were stoned to death on the whole. And people just regarded talking to the dead as something that some people did, some people didn't. You know, it was something that happened, not necessarily talked about, not even specifically written about. Obviously there were witches and things like that, and that's another kettle of fish which I'm not going to look at. But in some other parts of the world, they were much more further forward in their attempts to talk to the dead. For example, in China, starting about 400 AD, they used a pendulum system to talk to the dead. So what they would have is they would have a pendulum on a little frame, and there would be a tray of sand. And the pendulum would describe figures in the sand, and those would then be read. So basically, that's the earliest form of automatic writing that we've got from 400 AD. And that started in the Fuji dynasty in China, and it went on largely until the Manchu dynasty, which started in 1644. For those 1200 years it happened, there were all sorts of rules laid down about who should be allowed to do it and about how it should be done. And then, as I say, in 1644, during that dynasty, it was actually outlawed. But prior to that, at the start of this automatic writing period, at 400 AD, there were a series of Taoist texts that were written. And there are something like, from that period, 1,400 separate texts, and 6 of them were specifically written by spirits using this pendulum technique. So obviously an incredibly slow way of writing, of composing a book. However, these were basically the first channeled books that we've got. We've got various bits during sort of 1500s, 1600s and so on. So we've got people like John Dee allegedly summoning up spirits, protective circle there so that they can ask this person a few questions. We've also got Shakespeare writing around about this time. Shakespeare obviously dotting all of his stuff with spirits who are there to represent the conscience, the guilty conscience of people. This is the spirit of Banquo and Macbeth, who's obviously just offed him. You know, so we've got that. We've got Hamlet's dad, etc., etc. So spirits talking to the dead was used pretty much as a literary motif, as a shorthand for showing the anguish, or as a shorthand for having some sort of dialogue, but rather than doing it as a monologue, being able to question the person that was dead, or have the questions that may be in mind from the audience put to the person who committed it. Things did not change very much. It's not until we get to relatively recent that all sorts of different things started to happen. So I appreciate I've done, you know, the first 10,000 years of human history in a quarter of an hour, and I'm going to spend the rest of my time on the last 200 years. That's because that's where we have all of the records from, or most of the records from, and that's where all sorts of different things actually started to happen. And I'm sure you can work out who the next people are going to be. The Fox sisters. 1848, Hydesville, New York. Hydesville, incidentally, in the American version of Life on Mars, this is where Sam was transported to. I watched enough of it to ascertain that and didn't bother watching any more. So, 1848, we have the Fox sisters. Margaret, Kate and Leah. And what they did was they told everybody that they'd started to get in touch with a spirit. And after questioning him, they found that this spirit was actually a murdered tinker or peddler who was actually buried in the basement of their house. And they were able to communicate to him by the old once for yes, twice for no, or vice versa. Okay, an agreed symbol, an agreed code like that. They weren't the first people to use that code, but they are definitely the ones who really, really popularised it. So 1848, they started doing this, and it mushroomed, it spread throughout the world. It was the start of the religion of spiritualism. And spiritualism as an organised religion still continues today, and the headquarters are still at Hydesville, where the Fox sisters lived. all sorts of controversy, lots and lots of arguments, toing and froing. There's all sorts of confessions as well, particularly from one of the sisters who in later years fell on very hard times, had problems with her marriage, had problems with drinking, etc., etc. And somebody offered her a potload of money to admit that it was all a hoax. And she did. She took the money and admitted it was all a hoax. And then a few months later she said, well, actually, my admission of guilt was a hoax itself. So there's all these sorts of things there. A lot of people feel that the Fox sisters were able to produce these mysterious knocks, these spirit raps, from an ability to crack their joints. So this sort of thing. That sort of thing, okay? The couple of people in the front row probably heard that, okay? But the Fox sisters could do it in particular with their ankle and their knee joints. In other words, if they were sitting at a table, they wouldn't have to do that. They'd be able to do it without people seeing what they were doing. And also, they could do it incredibly loudly, a lot louder than I was able to do it there. And they would give the audible knocks, okay? So that's where some people feel that the Fox sisters were actually coming in from this. But they started, as I say, a whole religion which is still going now. And the sort of things that were happening with this were seances, people sitting round, usually in either totally dark or at least semi-dark situations. I've always wondered about this. If spirits exist, and if we can talk to spirits, why do they have to have the dark situation? I've been reading a book at the moment about one particular medium from the early part of the 20th century, Eusebia Palladino, and she did some of her sittings in relatively good light. Daniel Dunglass Hume, 20 years, 30 years earlier than Palladino, he did the majority of his work in full light. So you could see what he was doing. But again, there's a lot of controversy about each of these individuals' mediums, irrespective of the fact that they were doing these things in light. And the sort of things that they were doing was they were getting spirits to talk, but they were also doing more visual things. And one of the key elements that they did was this, table tipping. And I think you can work out where it got its name from. Table tipping is one of those things, like ectoplasm, which has fallen out of favour of late. There are one or two mediums who will still do it. I was at a seance 3 or 4 years ago in Edinburgh at Mary King's Close. And there was a medium there, and we had a table, and several people pressing on the table. Flimsiest table you could possibly imagine. Those of you who know Mary King's Close, of course the floors in there are absolutely level, so nothing would be up. Oh no, sorry. The floors in there are it's like a relief map of the Himalayas, the floors in there. So if you've got a flimsy table on there and you've got several people pressing on that, it is going to move. The miracle in a situation like that would be if the table didn't move, quite frankly. Okay, so very, very limited occasions table tipping does occur. Derren Brown does it. But I think we probably need to gloss over him in terms of talking to the dead. There are some people who believe that Derren Brown does his things with mystical powers. I kid you not. He doesn't. I'm sure I didn't need to say that for anyone. There are a couple of people who brought mediumistic abilities to the masses. They took them on stage. They did seances live on stage. And it's the Davenport brothers. Ira and William, it's the two gentlemen on the outer ends, the two guys in the middle. One of them's a medium, the other one's their manager. And they would go on theatre tours. They started in about 1850 and went on for 10 years to 1860. They did theatre tours. They would sit in a box, totally sealed. There was an opening in the top, curtain at the front, and they would be tied before the whole thing started. And then what would happen was the medium would start doing his business, and there would be a tray of items in the middle of the cabinet. And partway through, these items would suddenly start being hurled out from the top of the cabinet. And then they would open up the curtains, and lo and behold, the Davenports were still sat in there, tied exactly as they were before. So that obviously proves that it was spirits that were doing this. proved it for a lot of people, it genuinely did. However, not far from where we are now, just down in Piccadilly at the Egyptian, oh God, what's it called? It's not there now, but it was a massive theatre down in Piccadilly. And there was a young gentleman by the name of Jasper Maskelyne who was watching, and he just happened to be sitting in a particular position, and the curtains in the theatre leading to the exterior were not quite fully clothed. And what he could see, there was a chink of light shining. So he could actually sit where he was and he could watch. Time myself, throw that one out to him, back in the ropes. And Maskelyne then went on the road himself. This was one of the first magic shows that he did. He went on the road himself, doing all of the tricks that the Davenports did, but doing them without the benefit of a cabinet, without the benefit of the curtains. In other words, doing them in full view of the audience, saying, hey folks, this is what the spiritualists, the mediums, etc. do to convince you that they can talk to the dead. I can do them as well. Look, exactly the same effect was being produced. So he was a debunker. He was going around showing how these things were being faked. He was not the only debunker by a large measure, but he was possibly one of the first major ones. He was one of the first who made his name on doing this sort of thing. There's a homegrown seance, as it were, showing the same sort of things that were taking place. So here we've got a trumpet floating around through the room. Now then, this gentleman enters into the picture. At this time there are all sorts of different things happening. They're all pretty concurrent. So this is kind of 1860, and this is a gentleman by the name of Henry Slade. And Henry Slade is the guy who came up with this, slate writing. The idea was that you would take a piece of slate and a piece of chalk, just the sort of things that you would use at school to make your notes on, etc, etc. In the dark of the seance, they would be laid just on the table, and you would ask your message. Lights would eventually come on a bit later. You would look at the slate. It was previously clean, but then, by the end of the seance, it magically had a message from the dearly departed. So this was something that a lot of people were doing, and it was Henry Slade who popularised this in 1860. In 1876, whilst he was going around demonstrating this, he was jumped. He was jumped on stage, basically. He had everything set up, the lights were still on, the seance proper hadn't started, but he had the slates there. Some people ran up on stage, grabbed hold of him, pinioned him, picked up the slates, picked them up, showed them to the audience. They already had the chalk messages on in advance. So that was a bit embarrassing for Mr. Slade there. So that largely stopped his career. There are other people who did continue to use slate writing, however, because the description I've just described there, ooh, terrible use of English, the scenario I just painted there was not the only way of getting the messages onto slates, particularly if you were doing it, say, in a family home or something. You could quite simply have someone in another room listening. What's the question? Okay, the answer's going to be this, writing it on there, and then in the dark, this would take place in the dark, just handing the slate with the answer over to the gentleman, to the medium in question. In this case, the medium is a gentleman by the name of Harry Houdini. Houdini started his early life working with his brother as a medium. The pair of them knew magic, and they would go out and they would do mediumistic seances. They would communicate with the dead for a price. And they totally faked it. They were admitting they faked it, not to their customers, of course, but they faked it. They produced fake items. I really want to stress that. A few years later, Houdini got a fit of the conscience and felt that he could not bullshit people anymore. So he stopped doing it, and he went over to the other side, as it were. He decided to become a major debunker. So Houdini would travel around the place debunking all of the sorts of things that he himself had done to earn a crust. And what he would do, what his favourite thing of all was doing, would find out who the most famous medium in a particular town is. Go to there, heavily made up, heavily in disguise. It would go there. In the middle of the seance, when they'd perhaps produced a bit of ectoplasm or something, he would leap up, grab hold of the medium, shout, well, presumably holding him with one hand, pull off his disguise, shout, "I am Houdini, you are exposed." And just at that exact same moment, the friend that he brought with him would happen to have a camera, which they would whip out, photograph the thing that was happening, i.e. Houdini with the medium pulling out the ectoplasm and all this sort of thing. And by some staggering coincidence, that person with the camera was a photographer for the local newspaper. That photograph ended up on the local newspapers, on the front pages, local medium exposed by Harry Houdini. By the way, you can see him in the Adelphi Theatre next week. It was a publicity thing for him. He would go around exposing these people to give himself greater publicity. Can you actually hear that? Yeah, I can feel it. One of the classic things that was used in seances were these trumpets. Several different uses. You would often have them coated with dots of luminous paint, and during the seance you would see them move. You would see the dots of luminous paint moving as the trumpet was moving around. Alternatively, you could have them without the luminous paint and perhaps even hidden before the start of the seance, and then what you could do is, as the medium, you could pick them up, speak into one end, and you'd basically be speaking into the ear of just one person. And you, sir, have received a message, but nobody else heard it, so that must be from the spirit. Thank you. I believe. Excellent. See, I've made a religion. I've got my first convert. So these are the sort of things that we do. But, you know, things march on. People can see that there's lots of money being made from this. There's lots of people investigating it scientifically. Society for Psychical Research and organisations like this, they were set up in the 1880s to investigate these things. They've got records of thousands and thousands of seances and investigations. All that material is available if you join the SPR. Some of it's even available if you don't. But one thing that majorly came into it was something called the Kennard Talking Board. And these first started being produced in 1890 by a gentleman called Mr. Kennard. I see you're with me there. And this is it. This is the first talking board. The original 1890 talking board. So, you know, what does a talking board do? Oh, yes, wow, the spirits are with us today, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, you asked questions of it, and you used a small piece of wood called a planchette, and it would spell out things on the talking board. Now, the planchette was originally an item totally by itself. In the 1850s, the planchette would be used with a pen or a pencil inserted in it, and you would put your fingers on it, ask questions, and it would move about because it would be on three little wheels. These ones generally just slide across the top of the board, but originally they were on little wheels, and they would write on pieces of paper. So again, we've got a European version, if you like, the first appearance in Europe of automatic writing. And lots of books were dictated in this manner. Chronologically, going to leap ahead of myself a little bit, but I just want to show you an example of a book that has been written by spirit writing, by this sort of thing, by a planchette, by a, well, in this case it was a Ouija board. Some of you may be fans of Arthur Conan Doyle. You may know his interest in the paranormal. A lot of books you read will say that started in 1914 during the First World War when several members of his family died. But no, he actually joined the Society for Psychical Research in the 1890s when he was a young doctor in Portsmouth, so long before Sherlock Holmes came on the scene, or just before Sherlock Holmes came on the scene actually, and he attended several seances there. And obviously he died in 1930. And that was the end of it. No, Conan Doyle has appeared at numerous seances ever since then. Previous talk I gave at UNCON, I actually showed you some photographs of that. Don't intend showing you photographs of those again. But what I've got here is a book written by Arthur Conan Doyle 70 years after he died. Arthur Conan Doyle's book of the Beyond. It's a group of people in France who communicated with Conan Doyle, and he tells us what it's like in the afterlife. So if you want to know what to expect when you shuffle off this mortal coil, ladies and gentlemen, a mere £7.95 will let you know. It's my copy, you're not going to see. So, you know, automatic writing is responsible for a lot of things. Now, originally, you'll notice I quite deliberately call this a talking board, because originally that's what they were called. It wasn't until much later that they actually came to be called a Ouija board. In 1901, William Fuld took over the production of these, took over the company, and he started calling them Ouija boards at that point. He did get the name from the originator, from Kennard. Kennard claimed that the Ouija board, the talking board, whatever, had given him the name itself, and he claimed that the name was from the ancient Egyptian for the phrase good luck. That was Kennard's story. Originally, Fuld ran with that story. He used it in his publicity, and he eventually changed the story a few years later, and he said that it's actually from the French and the German for yes. So, we and ya, Ouija board. I could do the, how do Glaswegians talk to the dead? They use a Ouija board. Okay, those of you from Scotland got that. This is one of the original, or one of the early adverts for the Ouija board. The Ouija is without doubt the most interesting, remarkable and mysterious production of the 20th century. This is from 1901, so they're kind of thinking they're not going to invent anything else in the next 90 years. Its operations are always interesting and frequently invaluable, answering as it does questions concerning the past, the present and the future with marvellous accuracy. The English journal Light, that's the Spiritualist Union journal, says it certainly seems a readier method of communicating than the planchette. Okay, so there's praise indeed. Yours for a mere $1.50. Okay, absolute bargain there. And eventually those boards were sold all over the place. They became so popular that in the 1960s, the family of Fuld, he sold them to, they sold the rights for the boards to Parker Brothers, the toy manufacturer. And Parker Brothers still make Ouija boards to this day. You tend not to find them in shops in the UK. I don't, you know, you go into Hamleys, into the toy section, say, can I have a Ouija board, please? And, you know. But go into the States and you can't readily buy them. There are some quite cool ones. Parker's actually do a glow-in-the-dark Ouija board, which has got to be the coolest thing. How fantastic is that? It's back to Houdini again briefly. This is William Davenport. Houdini exposed mediums as part of his career, if you like. Davenport faked it, but, you know, by the 1910s, by 1915, I think this photograph was taken, they were friends. There was no animosity between them, which is quite nice. But just to show you how much Houdini traded on this, giving the truth behind spiritualism. Do spirits return? Houdini says no and proves it. And you get 3 shows in one: magic, illusions and escapes. All of which go to show fraud mediums exposed. Okay, so, you know, that's at the Lyceum. September, we missed it, it was September, that's a shame. Houdini did expose these things, but he was interested. He was fascinated in the prospect of life after death. And he was enormously close to his mother. That is a really important one not to get wrong there. He's enormously close to his mother. And when his mother died, he spent time going to mediums trying to get genuine communication with her, and he felt he never did. And in fact, it's this incident that broke the friendship between Houdini and Conan Doyle. Lady Jean Conan Doyle, Arthur's second wife, was also a medium, and she did automatic writing. And Conan Doyle had insisted time upon time that Houdini should attend a séance with his wife, and he's always said no. And eventually one day it just wore him down. He said, oh, all right. So he went, and there was just the three of them there, and she did the automatic writing and all this sort of stuff. And Houdini looked at it and read it back. And it was all written in beautiful English. His mother was the wife of a Polish rabbi, and she never actually learnt to speak English, so she couldn't do it. So that was really bad. He didn't like that aspect. And when he got to the very end of the message, what he found was it was signed off with his mother's name, but also a little cross. Remember, Jewish, rabbi, you know. So he felt that this was complete, absolute fraud, and really that was the total end of his friendship with Conan Doyle. Great shame as well, because the cross was actually an affectation of Lady Jean Doyle. She had added that herself as a little signature to say this is a Lady Jean Doyle original kind of thing. That was not part of the message, so a little bit of a misunderstanding there, which was a shame. Houdini did write a rather marvellous book called Among the Spirits. A Magician Among the Spirits, which came out in 1924. And there is a facsimile edition of this book available, which includes all of his own notes, his marginalia, so how the second edition would look. But it was unfortunately never published. The facsimile edition obviously was, but the second edition was never published. I desire to make clear to the reader by this prefatory note that I do not deny the possibility of spiritualistic phenomena. So he was open to it, but simply wish to put on record, after 30 years of intensive research in the sincere endeavour to discover the truth, I am forced to a confession that I have not succeeded in gaining knowledge of the actual existence of such phenomena. In other words, he was a fortune. He was interested in this topic. He went out looking for the evidence, and if he found the evidence, then he would believe. In fact, like I suspect a number of people have done, he made a pact with his wife, such that whichever one of them died would contact the other one through a medium and give them a specific message. Houdini died in 1931 on October the 31st. And for 10 years, on the anniversary of his death, Bess would attend a séance, hoping to get a message from Houdini. It was a simple message. It was one word. That was all. One word. Big thing, big séance, very famous. In the 10th year, the final one, she got the word. She got the message. Unfortunately, 1 month prior to the séance, she had been interviewed by a newspaper reporter, and in that interview, she had said what word she was looking for. Prior to that, the 9 years prior, where she hadn't revealed what the word was, she didn't get it. I've said that word several times today. That word has appeared on screen. The word was believe. Simple as that. It was the word that was written on the slate board earlier on. The séance actually still continues. And the final one with Bess was recorded. So you can go out and you can buy a gramophone record of said séance. Alternatively, you can actually download it for free as an MP3 off the net. So you can listen to the full séance. It still goes on today though. On the anniversary of his death, so 1 week today, in the Magic Castle in the States, they will hold the Houdini séance, the annual Houdini séance. And it's not done as a magic trick. It is done as a genuine attempt to contact Houdini, because his thoughts were very clear from what we've said there. This is a book by Arthur Conan Doyle, which looks at some of the work of Houdini, showing how Houdini is not a magician, not an escapologist. All of his works that he do is actually guided by the spirits. That's how he does these things. This is Edison. Thomas Alva Edison, one of the sort of most prolific inventors of the world ever, I guess, in 1928 mentioned in one interview only that he was working on a device using cylinders, needles and potassium permanganate to try and communicate with the dead. He was never successful with this as far as we're aware. Other people at the same time were working on the same sort of thing. This is Marconi, the pioneer of telegraphy, the radio and all that sort of thing. So it seemed fairly obvious that if he came up with a system to communicate through the airwaves, he may well be able to communicate with the dead, because what's the difference? They may just be a bit further away or something. Other people continued the mediumistic approach. This is Helen Duncan producing some ectoplasm or cheesecloth from her ear. This is Helen Duncan herself, who perhaps most famously nowadays was tried in the 1940s for revealing state secrets during a séance. She told people in the séance that a certain ship had been sunk during the war, and at that point nobody was supposed to know. It was a state secret. It was felt that if it was known that this ship had been sunk, it would, be very damaging to morale. So, she was banged up. She was tried and found guilty. Not her first trial, let's be honest, but she was put in prison. There is a campaign at the moment to try and get the conviction squashed. She's not still in prison. She's out and now subsequently dead. So it's just a recognition of her abilities that people are wanting. The problem is she was tried and found guilty under the Fraudulent Mediums Act, which is subsequently repealed. But basically, if they, take away that conviction, that would be equivalent of the court saying that witchcraft and mediumship exists. So I don't think they're going to get that conviction overturned. So I don't think that's going to happen in the courts any day soon. Perhaps one of the most famous ways of talking to the dead nowadays is electronic voice phenomena. Recording, listening back to the recording and hearing what messages come through. There were some early attempts or accidents which claim to have recorded this. So for example, in the 1930s, the Swedish army made some recordings of radio signals which had all sorts of different voices in them. They were polyglot signals. And nobody was able to explain exactly where they came from. They shouldn't have been there. But perhaps the most famous person with this is Friedrich Jürgensen, who in 1959 was recording birdsong. And as he was recording birdsong, parabolic microphone, all that sort of thing, headphones, played them back, and he heard voices. And as he listened to these voices, he found they were actually referring specifically to him. They were giving messages to him. They were using his name. And he continued recording these. He wrote about them. They became widely known. And this man came on the scene, Konstantin Raudovir. In 1965, Raudovir went through and spoke to Jürgensen, and he convinced himself that they were genuine, and he produced a book in the early 1970s, which was the culmination of 20,000 recordings that he had produced of EVP. That book was eventually translated into English in 1976, and it came with a free 7-inch single. So you got samples of this. That single was eventually given away with the part works, The Unexplained. It was the free gift with issue 1 back in 1980. Oh, I did buy it at the time, yeah. Oh my God, I know I don't look old enough, but... Big laughs from the front there. This man here is another person who is instrumental in the system of talking to the dead. He worked with two guys called William O'Neill and George Meek. This gentleman is called Hans Müller. And the important thing about Müller is, even though he was working with Meek and O'Neill, he was doing it slightly different to them, because he was actually dead at this point. They were communicating via EVP. And between them, they managed to produce a system called Spiricom. And that's Spiricom in operation. This is O'Neill here. This is the huge big box of tricks, which nowadays could probably be something that big. And what they did was it allowed real-time communication. With the previous examples of EVP, what you would do is you would record, ask a question, leave a gap, then stop recording, play it back, and the answer would appear in your gap where you had left silence. This, you would ask a question, and what would then happen is you would hear the answer straight away. A little like this. I'm convinced. Anyone remember Sparky's Magic Piano? For those who didn't get it, so what it starts off there, O'Neill, the living, says, I don't understand. Muller says, the preamp. Or the preamp. Yes, I think that, he's telling you that he needs to use a different electric component in the system. So they were actually genuinely working together. If you want to make your own Spiricom, you can do so. The plans for Spiricom are genuinely available on the web. The rationale behind these guys is they wanted everyone to take part in this. They wanted other people to prove it for themselves, not just take their word for it. So they produced regular updates, and those are all collected together in the form of a PDF, so you can download them and see exactly what was happening at the time. There are plenty of other ways of doing EVP which do not involve massive things like Spiricom. Plenty of books that show you how to do it. You can use your home computer. You don't even have to have a recorder of any sort. Nowadays, the sort of tool of choice, if you like, is the dictaphone. Specifically, solid-state dictaphones. No tapes involved in those. So what you do, switch it on, talk, blah, 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 ask your question, leave the gap, and listen for the playback. A lot of these are voice activated, which is the best thing ever for EVP. Because I remember 1981 getting my copy of the Unexplained, getting my tape recorder out, and then listening back to all this silence for ages thinking, was there something there? But these things will only record when something is on. So what you do is you do it, and then you get your answer back in there with all of the silence clipped out. You could argue you're introducing artifacts by doing that. So a purist, I guess, should switch off the voice-activated bit and continue listening to all of the silence that's in there. I am, however, going to show you exactly how EVP is done. That's it. Sample of EVP, folks. I'll play again. Means I have to go back. Okay, so there's a lot of static, a lot of background noise in there, but there is quite clearly some sort of utterance, some sort of word in there. Play it again, and this time I'll show you what the word is supposed to be. No, I'm not getting that either. And that's what's called a Class A EVP sample. There are genuinely ones that are a lot better than that. The ones that are best are the ones that you've recorded yourselves, so you know what the situation was. There's a lot of work still being done on EVP. It's very much a system that is ongoing. And in fact, we've got one of the latest developments of EVP here. We've got something called Frank's Box. This is an early version of Frank's Box, a gentleman over in the States. And what he did was he built a device which scans through radio waves backwards and forwards, just moving up and down the band. And that gives the sort of noise, the random noise that the spirits can then manipulate so that they produce sounds. It works on medium wave, and it's crap. It's crap in the UK because there's not much medium wave broadcast nowadays in the UK compared to the States. So in the States you're getting a lot more usable material because it actually relies on voices coming through on the tape, on the radio signal. It's not just static. EVP, spirit communication in general, has entered popular culture. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie White Noise. First, well, actually both of them I really like. Some people find them, but they're cynics. There are other aspects where talking to the dead has made quite big inroads. Most Haunted there. Yeah, let's have a look quickly at Most Haunted.
know the name Robert walks around, and I know Mary does, but there's this peaceful, calm, spiritual activity there with... Mary loves Dick.
I can't add anything to that. In fact, I can't.
Is he telling you something, Derek? Just giving you a name. Creed! Creed! Derek? Oh, come forward, Derek.
It said there, Creed Keffer, surviving documents show no record of this person. Of course they don't, for two reasons. Firstly, the spelling of Creed Keffer they had there was incorrect. K-R-E-E-D-K-I-F-I-R. I know the spelling is the one that I've just given you rather than the one that they gave you, because Kieran O'Keefe, the parapsychologist for Most Haunted, thought, I'm not entirely convinced by Derek Acora. If he is being possessed by spirits of people, why are they all bad Liverpudlian actors? So he decided to test him. And what he did was he produced some documentation for the venue that they were going to, made it totally up himself, and it was a prison, and he wrote down all about this prison guard called Creed Cafe, and just left those notes lying around. I think he planted it on the internet as well, but he left that information around where it may be happened upon by somebody. And he just left that there, thinking if Derek's a fake, then he might actually just mention Creed Keffer in passing. Better than that, he got possessed by him. For those of you who are into anagrams, Creed Keffer is an anagram of Derek Faker. Yeah, but that didn't seem to destroy Derek Acora's career. He still tours theatres, he still does massive seances, people come and buy the tickets and all this sort of thing. He even contacts Michael Jackson. This was the Michael Jackson seance from last year with his biggest fans. Yes, some very strange people there. Now, some people can take this talking to the dead to the extreme, I'm afraid. How's he going to read the message? Anyhow, that does bring us to the end of this show, just a really brief look through, but I thought I would leave the last word to the original talking forward.